Hello? Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, no problem. Vinith, can you ask Sable sir if he's joining or not?
Okay, ma'am, I'll ask.
Just ask. The speaker is joining in a minute. I just called him. Hello, Dr. Dalal. Are we audible?
Yes, yes. Hello, hello. Good to
Hi,
see you.
hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. We'll start in a minute.
Sure, sure.
Madam Sabe sir will be joining in few minutes.
Okay,
No
so
problem.
we'll
We'll
start.
wait for him.
We'll start.
Okay.
Okay, so a very good morning to all of you, and I welcome all of you once again to our 10th talk of the Archaeology Discussion Group for the running academic section. For all who are joining us for the first time today, just let me mention a few lines about the Archaeology Discussion Group of Deccan College. This is a initiative that was started in 1980s, where basically it was done to encourage a healthy academic exchange between our students and our faculties, and of course research scholars and faculties from different parts of India, also all over the world. So we are kind of continuing that tradition, that legacy till today. And of course, because of the corona and the pandemic situation, now we have moved on to an online mode of doing it. So today we are very happy and honored to have with us Dr. Kurush Dalal. Just let me mention a brief, for all the people from Deccan College, of course, Dr. Dalal needs no introduction, but, just to be a little formal, let me mention a few things about him. Dr. Dalal is he is the director of School of Archaeology at the Institution Trust. He was a former faculty at the Center of Extramural Studies, University of Mumbai, for almost 10 years, where he taught archaeology and allied subjects. He acquired his PhD from the University of Pune on the topic the early Iron Age in Rajasthan. He has extensively worked on the west coast of India and has undertaken excavations at sites like Sanjan, Chandor, and Mandar. The database that he collected from these sites has allowed archaeologists to identify over 25 coastal sites which belong to the early medieval period and now the early historical period. He has concurrently worked on memorial stones and asker stones in India, and his other interests are in numismatics, defense archaeology, architecture, ethnoarchaeology, and allied disciplines. He's also he's very well known for research in culinary anthropology and food archaeology. Currently, Dr. Kurush is also a consulting editor at the Life History India, where he consults with the team on issues pertaining to archaeology, culinary anthropology, history, and art. He has co-directed Salsit Exploration Project, which is a large-scale urban archaeology project documenting the archaeology of Mumbai. He has published also very rigorously. He has published over 35 academic papers in reputed international and national peer-reviewed journals, and of course has read many more at national and international conferences. He is also a visiting lecturer at various universities, colleges, schools, and government institutes. So, with those few lines, I welcome Dr. Dalal once again. The stage is all yours, sir. You can start. And today, of course, we will be talking about Archaeobroma, the food archaeology of food.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Sarkar. Absolute honor to be at the old alma mater. Have benefited greatly from these lectures. There was a time when anybody coming to India would drop by, uh, or coming from other parts of India, if they were going to Bombay, would drop by at Pune and would be dragged in kicking and screaming to talk about their latest work at these lecture series. And one didn't think at that time that one would one day be actually at the delivering end and not at the receiving end. So thank you very much. It's also the 200th year of the old alma mater and makes me incredibly proud to be able to be here and to speak to all of you all. So I'm going to speak about a topic that's very close to my heart and something that I am very incensed about it not being part of mainstream archaeology in India. So if you think that I'm doing a little bit of prachar, yes, I am. So I won't waste too much time and I'll launch into the presentation and try to be as brisk as possible because since you all are all archaeologists here, a lot of it will not need extensive explanations, but will be much easier to take for granted that you all know these things.
चल रहा है ना चल रहा है He's sharing the PPT.
Yes.
Irfan, can you please mute yourself?
Sorry, ma'am.
Chalo. So if we don't have a couple of interruptions, it's not a Zoom call. What we're going to talk about today is Archaeobroma, or the archaeology of food and the culinary anthropology of food. And I'm going to basically tell you how I got into this. So I grew up on all the wrong stories thanks to my mother. She being an archaeologist and alumni from Deccan College. Gory tales of Ashoka Maurya coming to the throne, his hands covered in the blood of his brothers. Stories of Alexander's invasion of India, and so many other amazing tales from ancient India. I wonder sometimes now whether those were the right tales for a 3 to 5 year old, but well, they shaped what I am and they ended up making me go to Deccan College and do a PhD there. Sadly, as we all know, jobs in Deccan College are hen's teeth, and one has to do other things too. I've been incredibly lucky in my life. My mother had an even harder time in archaeology because women in those days were treated as second-class citizens, and it was kind of taken for granted that women couldn't do field archaeology. So she was one of the first people from Deccan College to do archaeology on her own and excavate on her own. And after doing that, she then, well, retired to a life, a more humdrum life, and quite by chance ended up becoming a caterer. She married my dad, who was a shippy. She went out to sea. She saw food all over the world, and she brought that back with her. So this love of archaeology and food came thanks to her, and thanks to eating amazing things at home, discussing them, and of course, discussing their history. Down the years, I realized that I had a great fascination for the history and the antecedents of food that I ate, and therefore, I was very, very interested in the history and archaeology of my food. A few years ago, I mean, now quite a few years ago, about 12 years ago, a close friend of mine asked me why I didn't speak about the archaeology of food. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. There is really nothing to speak about. I really don't know. This is not my field, blah, 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 blah. My wife had said this a couple of times before. And, you know, like all husbands, in my favor, and decided that this was not my cup of tea. Said friend then pushed me into doing a menu with her at her food lab of food that would have been eaten through the years. So we talked about what the Harappans would have eaten, what the second urbanization would have eaten in the Ganga Valley, so on and so forth. And we made an entire menu of dishes down the ages. And that seemed more fun. And then one day, about 8 days before the event, she called up and said, tickets are selling well. And we've told everybody that you will be speaking about the archaeology of food for an hour before that. And I looked at her and said, are you mad? And a done deal and people are paying for it. So I realized I had to put something together. And much to my surprise, I always thought that Uncle Google would help me. And I just Googled these things, right? And there was nothing on the archaeology of food in India. So I was completely blown away. I sat down and took serious stock of the topic. And I asked myself what I knew and what I had been talking about. And I realized that the building blocks for this had already been taught to me by my teachers at Deccan College. And this entire presentation today is a tribute to them in so many ways, it's not funny. I mean, I can't even mention all of them here, so I won't even try. But the entire faculty of Deccan College, past and present, which has taught me so much, is responsible for this that I'm putting forth here. So the history of the food habits of the Indian subcontinent have been very much in the limelight these days. Indian food is being talked about. We had that idiot who said curry was a spice, and there has been a great buzz about Indian food going on all over the place. And we've come to believe so many of the myths that we have created about our own food. We have created myths of appropriation and culture and how our food is ours and it's nobody else's. And we've created this myth called Indian food. And we've sold it to millions of people outside the country. We've also created this amazing urban Indian food called Indian Chinese Mughlai Tandoori, which we see in our urban centers. It's really not Indian. No Chinese would recognize the Chinese parts of it really. Mughals would have killed themselves by stabbing themselves with blunt spoons at the thought of this Mughlai. And the tandoori again is a very, very high. Nobody in the Northwest Frontier Province or anywhere else ever made tandoori gucci and tandoori carrots and so on and so forth and tandoori momos. So does this extreme end at one side? The other end is, of course, people who say every 50 kilometers the food of India changes and there is nothing like Indian food, but there is multiple microcosms that make up the macrocosm that is India. As usual, the truth lies between both of these things, and we really, really, really need to study them. You have to understand that there are three things human beings have to do to live. Two of them are completely voluntary. One of them is involuntary. Breathing is completely voluntary, so is sleep. You have to sleep. 36 to 48 hours is the maximum that you can push your body. And then your body just crashes and you go into a deep slumber. On the other hand, food, eating is something that you do voluntarily. And though you can voluntarily starve yourself to death, it is against everything that is human. And it is very, very much a part and parcel of what that we eat. So food anthropology is basically a sub-discipline of anthropology. And while anthropologists look at, human beings, anthropology, anthropos logos, the study of man, past, present, and future. Food anthropologists, on the other hand, specialize in the role that food plays and look at human beings, look at man through the lens of food. Now, this is something that came about thanks to the huge leaps in anthropology that came about in the 50s and 60s, especially in the United States. We have people like Leslie White, the Egans, Margaret Mead to thank. Of course, way before that, trailblazers like Malinowski and then Levi-Strauss had already laid down the building blocks. So there were so many people who were taking anthropology into new directions. And along with them came, in the latter half of the 20th century, a whole stream of people who started working on the anthropology of food. Mary Douglas, Marvin Harris, Arjuna Padurai, Jack Goody, Sidney Mintz, just to name a few. Sidney Mintz's seminal work, Sweetness and Power, published in 1985, made it very clear that slavery was something that was created by the British desire for sugar. Yes, slavery was created by the British desire for sugar and the creation of empire and the exploitative industrial labor conditions. And how, when it was looked down upon, a different kind of slavery, that of the manumitted slaves not wanting to make sugar, was replaced by the Girmittiers and the Jahajis from India. And this is why we have so many people of Indian origin in the West Indies and South Africa for starters, and Fiji. So research has now begun to talk about the material and symbolic importance of food, how people interact and intersect with food, differentiation in food, commensality, the role in industrialization, in globalization, in labor, in commodity chains, so on and so forth. Now, the archaeology of food, on the other hand, is a very, very interesting discipline, rarely ever directly spoken of by archaeologists. It is part of general research. Archaeologists have for a very long time been interested in food under the rubric of diet and subsistence. We talk about the plants that we grew, we talk about the plants that we domesticated, we talk about the animals we domesticated, and we talk about the wild animals we hunted. And it talks about the long-term historical development of food and its impact on cultures. But we rarely ever talk about the archaeology of food. We look at it as various different subdisciplines, as scientific subdisciplines in their own right, and we start getting down into the nitty-gritty to such an extent that we miss the wood for the trees. So recently, there has been an increased interest in food archaeology, and I've seen it changing by leaps and bounds as we go. And the archaeology of food has been fueled by a lot of new technologies and curiosity about implications that go well beyond diet and food. So they're now looking at political organization, social organization, and the development of civilization itself. And we are looking at it all through the lens of the archaeology of food. And we are realizing that, matter of fact, for most archaeologists, that had it not been for animal and plant domestication and the creation of surplus, there would have been no civilization at all. So there are, of course, two broad periods, as we all know, in archaeology of the world: prehistory, the time before written records, and history. In India, of course, we have that amazing period in between called proto-history, where some of the most crazy new discoveries in the archaeology of food have been coming in the last few years, and we really look forward to many more. Of course, there is the story of the ceramics, the vessels, the agriculture, the storage, the animal husbandry, hunting, food processing, painting, rock art, malnutrition, medicine, so on and so forth, all of which plays an enormous role in our understanding of where our food comes from and how it makes us what we are. That said, from roughly about 1.5 million years ago, thanks to Athrambakam, until roughly about 11,000 years ago, the people of the Indian subcontinent were essentially hunter-gatherers. Their food preferences and choices don't really directly have a bearing on the food that we eat today, apart from the taste profiles of sugar and salt, which are hardwired into the human body. These two overwhelming desires are a direct result of our prehistoric past in two very different ways. Sugar is essentially brain food. Sugar is the fuel our brains burn. Sugar is the fuel that, and the subsistence element of most of our nervous system, our myelin sheathing, so on and so forth. And our body is programmed to quest for sugar. So this great desire to eat things sweet is part of our body's mechanism to get itself fuel for the brain. Of course, today, with the rampant availability of white sugar, this is quite not working out in our favor. And because sugar was never plentiful in the past, we haven't worked out a means of getting rid of excess sugar from our bodies easily. So all the excess sugar is converted into fat by our livers. And yes, if you think too much and therefore you eat too many sweet things, you become fat. It's got nothing to do with thinking, guys. You can be a great thinker and be absolutely slim. Salt, on the other hand, is a much older story and goes way beyond our own evolution and the evolution of our brains, and goes back way beyond prehistory, right to our single-celled ancestors. And salt is what keeps the equilibrium between the cells and the integrity of the cells intact. Too much salt and our cells would shrivel up. Too little salt and our cells would fall apart, and we'd kind of dissolve, but we'd be dead way before that. Not to mention that as far as mammals are concerned, the ischemic pressures, or what we call blood pressure in our body, is regulated by salt. You have to have salt in your diet. You need about 3 grams of salt a day. Yes, a packet of Lay's will give you probably 5 times as much. So don't quote me on that, guys. But we get more than enough salt in our diets today. The main difference here is that hunter-gatherers do not need to add salt to their food. Because of their high protein diets, they get an enormous amount of salt with their animal protein. Whereas on the other hand, those who are not hunter-gatherers are forced to find sources of salt and to add salt to their diet, just like we do today. So everybody gets very upset these days about global warming and the end of the glaciation and how we're all going to get flooded and how the world is going to come to an end because we're all going to drown. And as a good archaeologist, I actually look forward to this event if it actually happens. I keep telling people who get very worked up about a 5 centimeter rise in sea levels that, well, roughly 10,000 years ago, there was a 120-meter rise in sea levels. And this was thanks to the end of the last glaciation. Human beings stopped being hunter gatherers, stopped being nomadic, and thanks to the plethora of food available in the period that we call the Mesolithic, we became sedentary. We started exploiting this increase in resources that had taken place in a warmer, wetter earth, especially in the coastal areas where the shallow coastal seas were formed, the warm coastal seas were formed, which bred tons and tons of food for us. The forests saw increasing rainfall and therefore increasing productivity because of the warmth. All the areas that were under the ice sheets became massive grasslands, savannas for animals to roam in, and food suddenly became so plentiful, we no longer had to move about. We could become sedentary for the first time in our lives, and this was our undoing. Nomadic peoples have a rule of one child in arms. Yes, traditional nomads never have more than one child that they're carrying in arms if they're hunter gatherers. This is because two children will result in the death of both children and the mother. The mother, of course, is the most important member of the tribe, a contributing member, and can have more children. The first child, which would be roughly about a year old by the time a second child came along at the earliest, would also have gone through the worst part of development and would therefore have the greater chance of survival than a newborn. Therefore, a newborn, if it was born before the first one had been weaned, would very often be exposed to the elements. This kept our population in check. When we settled down in one place, we had little better to do in the evenings. There was no internet, there was no Idea Mobile, there was no Netflix to binge watch. So we practiced procreation, and practice makes perfect, and we became amazingly perfect at this job, and our population skyrocketed. So Fikri Hassan and all of them who talk about paleodemographics will tell you that our numbers went crazy somewhere around 10,000 years ago. This led to war for the first time. Stronger groups started pushing weaker groups out of their foraging lands, and you have a lot of interesting work done on this, though of course there are arguments pro and con by people like Binford and others who say that essentially the weaker groups were forced into semi-arid areas where they had no choice but to grow their own food. The only food that they could grow, which would be grown once a year using the rains and which would then last them throughout the year, was cereal. So wherever cereals could be domesticated, these are grasses essentially, human beings achieved self-sufficiency in food by producing it themselves. And the roots of our Indian food cuisine, like the cuisine of most parts of the world, which are not in the hunting-gathering stages, is essentially the history of the Neolithic period and the post-Neolithic developments, and is all about the rise of agro-pastoralism. And this is why we eat what we eat, because we have to grow our own food, be it animal or be it plant. So all of our food and our food habits, the way we treat our foods, the way we prepare our foods, and the fact that the food that we eat is essentially incredibly carbohydrate rich. Sidney Mintz has a beautiful paper in the Anthropology of Food where he says that the food of the Indian shows you how all food is built around a central cereal. So there is a central cereal, everything else is peripheral and is used to make that cereal more palatable. So be it your dal, your sabji, your achar, your chutney, whatever it is just because the bulk of your food is either rice, wheat, barley, nachni, jowar, bajra, depending on what the grain of choice is or what the grain geography allows you to grow and climate allows you to grow in your specific niche. So these are, of course, the four main grains of the old world. Wheat on the top left, barley on the top right, which has almost disappeared in India today, sorghum or jowar on your bottom right, which came from Africa, according to most people who work in plant studies. But we surprisingly know that it was at Bagor in the Mesolithic period, 4,550 years ago. And of course, rice, which we battled with the Chinese for having the earliest rice, and we drove the poor Chinese nuts. And there was a whole battle that took place. And I remember Professor Kajle telling me about how Every time the Chinese would come back with earlier rice, we'd say, oh, by the way, we found some earlier rice than yours. Of course, we finally thrown in the towel and we accept that the Chinese had the earliest rice cultivation in the world. But very few people know that China actually started becoming a rice dominant landmass much, much later. That Indians were bulk cultivating rice way before the Chinese were. And it was a massive subsistence crop in India way before it was in China. Very, very surprising. The Chinese essentially ate a lot of millets and not rice in the beginning. These are the 5 main species that we domesticated in the beginning. And these are, of course, goat, sheep, cattle, pigs, and chickens. And what we cultivated was essentially what we domesticated was what was available in the wild. So India and China both used the Indian jungle fowl and domesticated the chicken. The wild ancestors of goats and sheep are known to us from the Northwest Frontier Province, from the Urals, from the Golden Crescent, etc. And these were domesticated. Cattle, of course, are very, very Indian. And the Indian Zebu bull was definitely domesticated in the Neolithic in India. We have beautiful evidence from sites like Mehrgarh and, of course, all the Harappan sites. The Zebu bull crossed the impenetrable barrier for cattle of the tsetse fly zone of Central Africa and ended up becoming part of the Maasai and other tribes of pastoralists over there. The pig is one of the other very interesting domestications, domesticated multiple times from the wild boar, and is actually more of a subspecies than a species by itself as far as geneticists are looking at today. It is more a tamed wild boar than it is really a separate species, and it's very easy for pigs to become feral all over again, as we've seen in North America. So just to tell you how these things decide what we eat, just when you eat Chinese food, okay, there are no Chinese desserts, and no honey noodles is not a Chinese dessert. It's something that is very, very modern and something that the Chinese don't eat. The Chinese do not have a concept of dessert. At the most, the Chinese will serve fruit. So why is there no Chinese barfi, no Chinese rasgulla, no Chinese rabdi, no Chinese kheer? That is because the Chinese are essentially lactose intolerant, and lactose intolerant is the correct way for all mammals who have been weaned after finishing drinking their mother's milk. The fact that we are lactose tolerant today is because our ancestors learned a very important mutation of making sure that we did not switch off the lactase inhibitor, okay, which breaks down lactose, okay, in our stomachs, which all mammals are born with and which switches off when you're weaned of your mother's milk. So we have not really perfected it, those of us who do drink milk. And if you think back, you will remember that despite being told how much milk you need to drink, when you had a bad stomach, your mother would not ask you to drink milk because it would be difficult to digest. So it is curd, chas, lassi, paneer, butter, and ghee, which is processed, which is easier to digest than milk by itself. And of course, so much more cheese, etc., that is consumed. And just the direct consumption of milk is actually something that you do less and less of as you get older and older because you find it more difficult to digest. The Chinese, on the other hand, never learned how to keep that switch on. And the Chinese, basically, along with most East Asians, like the Japanese, the Koreans, and large parts of Southeast Asia, are completely lactose intolerant and therefore do not have any of the desserts that India does because they just can't digest milk. And it's all about what existed there. It was the chicken and the pig that were domesticated in China first, and Chinese Neolithic basically had chickens and pigs as its main meat source. You can't milk a chicken, it just doesn't have the required appendage, and nobody in their right mind would ever try to milk a farrowing sow because they're incredibly bad-tempered animals and will take your fingers off. There's also an enormous amount of food that is not our own. And when I started researching food, I realized that most Indians are completely clueless about the origins of their food and will tell you the most ridiculous stories, will refuse to believe recorded historical fact. 90% of Indians today do not know that potatoes, tomatoes, and chilies are not Indian, that peanuts are not Indian. The next time you want to really impress a friend of yours who's not into food studies or into archaeology, well, tell them you're going to take them out for some Portuguese food and then take them to the nearest vada pav stall and give them a vada pav. Pav, the word itself is the Portuguese word for bread. This kind of bread was never made in India, this kind of leavened bread, till the Portuguese brought this technique with them. The vada in the vada pav is made up of potatoes, which the Portuguese brought thanks to the Columbian Exchange. Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus, who brought these various different plants to us from the Americas, or rather opened the route for them. Uh, the chutney that is going with them is also made up of chilies that he brought. The fried green chilies, also thanks to him. The peanut oil in which they're fried is also thanks to Christopher Columbus and the Portuguese. And ultimately, the saddest truths are that the besan comes to us from West Asia. The garlic, originally a long time ago, came to us from Central Asia. So the only endemic Indian things in a vada pav, which is the ubiquitous marker of Bombay's food, is the kadi patta, the mori or the mustard seeds, and the haldi. All in all, it's a Portuguese dish, but it wasn't created by the Portuguese. And well, it isn't eaten by the Portuguese per se. So many of our fruits, the pineapple, the papaya, the chiku, the guava, all came to us thanks to the Columbian Exchange. And maize, makkah. So imagine this, 250 years ago, there was no makkah di roti to go with sarson da saag in the whole of Punjab. There was no makkah ka irab in the whole of southern Rajasthan, and so on and so forth. And there was definitely no butti ki kees in Indore. So all of this is thanks to food that we have appropriated. Today, our food is a amalgam of Mexican ingredients and tastes very much like Mexican food, and which is why Mexican food is very, very popular in India. And the last and cruelest blow, if you go up to the hills of India and you eat a hearty meal in Himachal or Kumaon or Garhwal or Jammu, it's usually a beautiful meal of rajma, rice, and ghee. And they'll tell you that this is their authentic meal. And rajma has barely been in India for 125 years. And it was brought to us by the French from Mexico. Yes, the French from Mexico via Pondicherry. So much of what we think is our own is not necessarily our own. And we must learn that we have borrowed and things have been borrowed from us. The most popular of the things borrowed from us is perhaps the famous black pepper. And we know so much about it going from and Pattanam, which is being excavated today, is being touted as the Muziris of the Periplus. And we know that it's going there, and we know that in the 3rd and 4th century AD, at Hadrian's Wall in England, the common legionary is able to afford some black pepper as part of their meal. And we know this because when we excavate the latrines and we do some good flotation in them, we find the shells of peppercorns that were passed through the alimentary canals of Roman soldiers. Yes, not perhaps the greatest hour in archaeology, but a very, very important thing that we archaeologists do. So that said, archaeology has told us that pepper has gone from India. Something that archaeologists don't talk about because there is no real direct evidence of it that way in the record is bananas. Bananas are a very, very Indian fruit, and Indian fruits went out of India to Europe along with the Greeks when they went back. The Arabs then took on the cultivation of bananas in a big way. They fell in love with this amazing fruit that comes in its own packaging, that ripens after you cut it from the tree while you're still transporting it. So it's easy to transport, it's easy to package. And of course, by today's standards, it's incredibly eco-friendly, biodegradable packaging, so on and so forth. And the fact that these bananas, okay, as we call them, are named after the Arab word for them. The Arab word for them comes from the Arab word banan, which means finger. And these bananas have gone from India all the way through Europe, and the cultivars have ended up in South America and have come back to us. And the bulk of the bananas that we eat are not Indian varieties, but varieties that have been reintroduced to India after they have gone and taken a world tour. We also give brinjals to the world, but that is something that we all know about. Nutmeg is not Indian. It comes from a small group of islands in Indonesia. Cinnamon comes from there. Uh, what you see on the bottom of this image is basically your vanilla pod. It comes from Madagascar, and it is the only large-scale exploited and eaten fruit of any orchid. There are a couple of others which are eaten in Sikkim, but they're eaten more for medicinal purposes. So the number one fruit in the world today is the banana. We gave the world the banana. It has changed the way food, destroyed the lives of people. It has created what we call the banana republics, and that is an entire lecture by itself. Suffice to say, it would be the world's greatest superpower if the banana was a country, and if the banana was a rock star, it would be Beyonce. That said, what are the tools that an archaeologist uses? An archaeologist basically uses paleobotany, archaeozoology, paleoanthropology, ceramic studies, ethnography, ethnobotany, art history, and today a lot of bioarchaeology. Paleobotany, as we all know, is the study of ancient plants. We do a lot of dry sieving and wet sieving. For data, we also do palynology, which is about spores and pollen, and this also tells us things when there are no other materials available. And we have that amazing discipline called phytolith studies, which also tells us so much more. So sieving, dry sieving, wet sieving, and I still remember, I don't know if it's all the same in your days, but we'd have a big tub and we'd pour water into it, then we'd pour soil into it from a likely location to have carbonized remains, and we'd stir it in a very scientific manner with a large wooden log or a stick, and we used to joking Manchurian soup, and then we would run a good rava sieve through it, smack it down on paper, and all the carbonized material in that soil would have risen up thanks to the wet sieving, would have floated up, would be collected in the sieve, knocked on the newspaper, very scientific again because it absorbs water and dries very fast, would be collected in bags and sent to the lab where it would be gone through in petri dishes. A lot of it would just be carbon which would be discarded, but all the plant material would then be retrieved and would tell us what the people of it. There would of course also be impressions in mud bricks and impressions in the cores of various different ceramics. We would also learn about the plants that we ate thanks to implements that were used, sickles, hoes, plowshares, etc. We would also have sometimes very luckily like a Chopani Mando, wild rice impressions which have survived due to the extensive use of cow dung in the animal pen floors. And then we come to archaeozoology. This is my favorite bit, and this entire bit is thanks purely to Dr. Joglikar, who was so kind in sharing his slides with me and so kind in sharing his PPT with me and came to lecture to my students at the university every year. What do? It's the interaction between humans, animals, and the environment. Together, this is called archaeozoology. I don't need to tell you this. I don't need to tell you about the different non-food and but various different animal parts come into being and they come to us in the deposit. Archaeologists collect them and then send them to archaeozoologists. So we have them in the general context, which is in and around habitation. On the edges of habitation, we have butchering sites and we have articulated bone remains or osteological remains, to be very precise. And they all tell us about various different processes of animal husbandry, domestication, wild animals that are hunted, so on and so forth. There are direct and indirect sources, DNA, proteins, amino acids, lipids, mites, bone tools, shell tools, beads, all of this, fish bones, all of this tell us so much about the different species, the environments. They tell us about the climatological conditions that existed in places. They tell us about localized climatic change as they did at Balathal. Please read the articles by Thomas and Joglikar on this, and so on and so forth. They tell us about important activity areas, especially where we have the discarded materials from butchering. They tell us about butchering thanks to cut marks. A lot of statistics are used by archaeozoologists. So if you want to do archaeozoology, you have to be good at statistics. And they tell you about fascinating things that come out of how consumption changed through various levels. They tell us about animals which are wild versus domestic and how those consumptions changed over a site. and they tell us about the breakdown of an animal carcass and at which point the carcass is broken down, if it's a large cattle or if it's a small cattle. And interestingly, for 4,000 years, we have been breaking down animal carcasses in exactly the identical positions and the identical cuts all over the Indian subcontinent. Sometimes we get some very exciting things like this, which excite the archaeologists and the non-archaeologists. So Harappan bones from sites like Karanpura in Rajasthan. These rhinoceros bones tell us some very interesting things. Some of them might have just been brought as oddities, but here they seem to be enough to show butchering. They also tell you that there were, well, rhinoceros in Rajasthan. So various different domesticated species. This is from the site of Kanmer in Kutch, excavated by Dr. Jeevan Singh Nain Singh Khadakwal of the Institute of Rajasthan Studies. What were the different animals used? What were they possibly used for? Of course, meat is what all animals were used for, but in the case of sheep, it was more for wool. The large cattle were essentially used for traction and for milk. Buffaloes were used for milk, and there seems to be a huge use of buffaloes for milk, which has come out from the excavations at Kanmer, and this is very interesting. The pig, of course, has always been almost exclusively used only for meat. We then have paleoanthropology. Human remains are studied. Paleoanthropologists look at various different things here. They look at biomechanics. They look at genetic studies today. We compare the way in which our teeth have shrunk, our mouths have become smaller, our canines have disappeared. And of course, we talk about the horrible dental cavities in early farmers, telling you about how terrible these diets were with their high degrees of sugar due to switching to grain from meat-heavy diets, and the results that we had to bear with. So a lot of people, especially at sites like Inamgaon, would have died very painful deaths in their old age from horrible cavities, ulcers, and abscesses. We don't have this in India, but we have some amazing stuff that comes out of bog bodies. This is Torun Man. There's a whole new article, and the remnants of his stomach have been reanalyzed in the last year with some fabulous results. But suffice to say that we got this beautiful bog body preserved in the bog due to anaerobic conditions and high iron content, and we got the remains of his stomach, and we could recreate the porridge. In the 70s, archaeology was very hot on television in Britain. The BBC had a show in which they actually recreated this porridge, and some of his memoirs that it took 2 large whiskies to keep it down. It was that terrible. Ceramists and explorers often also provide vital clues. This is the site of Koldiva, and you have beautiful cord marked and rice marked pottery, telling us that rice was grown even if we hadn't found the kind of rice remains that we did at the Neolithic levels. We also have tandoors. The earliest tandoors that we know of in the Indian subcontinent are not from the Northwest Frontier province, but are from northern Rajasthan, from the site of Kalibangan. Sadly, this is not a color picture, but there are beautiful brick red on the inside due to excessive use. And guess what? We have that beautiful potsherd from Kalibangan in fabric D, which shows a banana tree with a chicken underneath. So it's very easy to say that it's possible that the first tandoori chicken on the subcontinent probably happened at Kalibangan. We have this amazing fish hook from Padri, which Dr. Shinde excavated. I was there for 2 seasons at the excavation. It was a fantastic site. And I was there for 3 seasons at the site. And luckily for us, in a multi-room structure belonging to the early Harappan levels, we found this large fish hook, and we found in the adjacent room bones of the crucifix catfish, which is a deep sea fish, telling us that Harappan fishermen were going out with line fishing and catching catfish in the deep seas. We also have data like this, which comes to us. This is my favorite story that I like to tell children when I'm talking to them, of how the bricks were drying outside. A rabbit ran across these bricks in the search for seeds from the chaff that had been added to them. The dogs pursued the rabbit, and an opportunistic leopard passing by Harappa decided to try his luck at getting a dog. Though, of course, this is not true because all of these were found from different parts, but they tell us so many interesting things. The presence of leopards at Harappa, for example, very much like we have leopards living with human beings in the city of Bombay, the Harappans did on their periphery have leopards too. Flat dishes tell us about flatbreads, and they tell us about how people ate meals which were essentially based around flatbreads. Bowls tell us how meals were based around porridges. So, for example, when we talk about, we talk about southern India, in Karnataka, we have everything identical in the megalithic burials. The only difference is that we have flat black and red ware vessels in the north, in North Karnataka, and in South Karnataka, we have bowls. And it's the division between the flat bread and the ragi mudde that is coming forth just thanks to the ceramics. The people of Gujarat were tired of getting their hands burnt while they ate khichdi from bowls, and they actually invented the stud handle during the Sorat Harappan period, and actually probably a little earlier, as the excavations at Padri tell us that in the Padri ware that we have from the pre-Harappan settlement, which was a local pre-Harappan settlement, we actually have stud handle bowls from that period onwards. We also have imported stuff. We've always liked our imported booze just as we do today. And we have beautiful amphorae that tell us about the Indo-Roman trade. And we have amazing material that our chemists take out from the bottom, the resin from grape seeds, etc. We have Canaanite amphorae too. Very often the amphorae tell us about this amazing fish sauce called garum, which was made from fermented salted fish and which was actually the ancestor of the modern tomato ketchup. We have rock art, which tells us about the hunting and the eating of nilgai, the use of dogs in the hunt. And you can see this little fellow at the back herding the animals towards the hunters in the front. We have amazing rare examples like this, the overseer of the kitchens, which fed the pyramid builders. In his tomb, we have the entire process of bread making, from removing the grain from the silos, to cleaning the grain, to pounding and grinding the grain, to kneading the dough, to filling it in the molds over here, to taking these molds for baking, to demolding the bread, so on and so forth, and ultimately putting the bread, which you see over here, for the people to eat. We also have a broken mold from the which actually has a burnt loaf of bread in it. There's an enormous amount of micro study happening in ceramics. I don't have to tell you about it. You have some of it happening in your own backyard. I'm sure Prabodh has already spoken to you in detail about the amazing stuff that's coming out of his site. We have the amazing first curry in the world that came out of the site of Farmana. And we have this beautiful work done by Arunima Kashyap and Steve Weber, which tells us about this beautiful brinjal curry made with turmeric and garlic and mustard oil, which was made and which is now considered the world's oldest curry, as it's called. We have amazing starch residue analysis, which started right from the work being done in New Guinea at Cook Swamp. And we know that 10,000 years ago, there was major domestication of Dioscorea alata, the purple yam, or the Kamorio kand, as we call it in India. And this kand was very, very responsible for an incipient Neolithic culture that came up there. But sadly, it wasn't enough to create surplus, and they just wasn't the kind of animals to be domesticated there for civilization to actually happen. Subsequently, we have this amazing thing called protein residue analysis. Stone tools are rarely washed these days, but cutting tools and especially projectile points are all sent for protein residue analysis. It used to cost about $1,000 a sample. I'm told it's down to about $100 if you know the right laboratory. This is from Azraq in Jordan, 125,000 years ago. Either very, very early Homo sapiens, archaic, or Neanderthals were butchering rhinoceros. They also ate aurochs, ducks, horses, and camels, all wild, of course. And we know this thanks to the protein residue that is left behind in the blades from the last animals that were slaughtered by it. We have some amazing evidence now coming from Kotara Bhadli about the work done on milk. This is the work done by K.K. Chakravarti on Prabodh Shirvalkar's ceramics. I remember Prabodh saying that for 5 years he couldn't wash his pottery because he was waiting for them to take the samples and give him the results. And we now know that the earliest direct evidence of dairy processing in South Asia comes to us from the Harappan period, thanks to the lipid residues in the ceramics. It tells us that milk was being processed probably into curd and very simple cheeses at the Harappan sites. And this is something fascinating coming to us. So this is the kind of work that is, by leaps and bounds, changing the way we look at food and we look at food studies. This, of course, is the very famous Li Liu from Stanford, who has told us now, for a matter of fact, that we started collecting grains and making beer before we were even making bread. So this is the work from Rakafet Cave 13,000 years ago. And of course, we have biomolecular archaeologists like Patrick McGowan and others doing amazing stuff in Egypt and, working with reviving ancient yeasts and actually using those ancient yeasts to make beer again and to make bread and so on and so forth. You also have ethnoarchaeology and ethnobotany, which tell us about different millets and other things that have been cultivated in India, most of which are supposed to have come from Africa. We have a lot of foraged vegetables, and ethnobotany actually gives us evidence of this, which archaeology cannot. This is the very famous dragon stalk yam or the shevler, which is a ranachi bhaji, Amorphophallus comitatus. And ultimately, before we shut for the day, we have the greatest superfood that the Indian subcontinent has given the world, Ziziphus mauritiana. And ladies and gentlemen, the picture on the top left is actually from Africa and not from India. This has more vitamin C, iron, and other minerals than anything else, and is one of the greatest superfoods on this planet. We find it at all our Chalcolithic, Neolithic, and Harappan sites, and this is a very, very important part of the subsistence of the people right from those periods all the way till today. So, to conclude, archaeologists use a multi-pronged approach to reconstruct past dietary habits. This allows us to understand food habits, allows us to understand cultural evolution and adaptation. It helps us to understand the origins of food and the journeys taken by food and for food. And it plays a vital role in understanding of the man-land relationship and helping us understand why we eat what we eat. I think it's time to start a department at Deccan College. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dalal. That was really an intriguing lecture. I mean, I have been in Pune from 2005 and eating vada pav since then. But today I came to know that I have been eating a Portuguese dish for all these years. So it was really nice. A lot of new information that I had come to know. Now it's time for some interactive session. Do we have any queries?
Yes, ma'am. I have
Yes,
one
Aishwarya.
query.
Yes.
So,
Please, Aishwarya, go ahead.
yeah, so it was a wonderful lecture indeed, and I would like to thank you for this intriguing session. So, my query is that how one can start his or her journey as a food archaeologist in India.
So, number one, you can use this as your beginning. This lecture of mine, I think it's recorded, and I think it will be available to you all. Am I right?
Yes, yes.
So you can start from here, and please take it ahead. There is so much to do. I mean, there is so much that I had to cut out of this when Amrita said 45 minutes and then Q&A. I said, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I think I did 47 minutes. But that said, there is so much that we do in archaeology that is already part of the archaeology of food. We just don't look at it as the archaeology of food. You know, when we look at grains individually, we don't realize that these grains were all chapatis, puris, breads, khichdis, mudde, so on and so forth. Why aren't we looking at that? Why are we just seeing them as a plant remain? Why are we not seeing them as a food remain? Similarly, for stuff that we get from our archaeozoology people, similarly for stuff that we get from, understanding nutrients and things like that, from our paleoanthropology people, that has changed the way we are. I've not even talked about the biocultural adaptation of man. There's a beautiful paper by Wallenberg in Man and Environment sometime in the early 90s, I think. Professor Wallenberg's paper is all about how we've actually changed physically after we became farmers, because hunter-gatherers actually hold their heads up higher because they're always scanning the horizon. Farmers, on the other hand, look down. So the way our skulls sit on our backbones has changed because of farming. The fact that we can actually modify our bodies as farmers, now this is a permanent change, but we also have temporary changes. So for the fact that farmers spend their lives squatting on their heels, they can keep their feet flat, but not touch their backsides to the ground and squat and sit down while they're looking at things. They're looking out at their herds, they're looking out at their fields, something that we in cities cannot do any longer. You have to grow up doing this, or you have to go to yoga class and spend a lot of time and money. So many things that and I'm sure there are things that I haven't covered and things that I don't know about, which are part and parcel of the archaeology of food. So please start reading food workshop every year, about 4 or 5 times. You can come and join that if you want, where we look at various aspects, including the archaeology of food. And it's a very holistic study. Food cannot be studied just as archaeology. You need anthropology, sociology, media, history, so on and so forth to work with it. And we can take you there. Maybe we can ask Amrita ma'am to set up a special certificate course for the students of Deccan College, where we can do a studying food certificate course for them.
Absolutely.
And we can take it forward from there. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Aishwarya. Anybody else?
Uh, Sir, I would like to ask a few questions.
Please, Soham.
Yeah. So, sir, I came across a news article where it was said that people in wheat growing regions are more community oriented and people in rice growing regions are more individualistic. So, the examples provided were that North Indian festivals like Lohri, Holi, and others, there the entire village or the community comes together to celebrate them. Whereas in South India, festivals are mostly celebrated in individual homes and not together. So I found that interesting, but can we generalize this?
No,
Is this a phenomenon?
no, this is rubbish. What
Okay.
about the whole of Eastern India? Ask Amrita ma'am about
Exactly. We
Eastern
have
India.
festivals in Assam and Bengal, which is a completely community-oriented festival. Completely. It is not individualistic at all.
So there is a North and South divide to some extent, and that's more about
Yes.
behavioral anthropology and has not got to do with what they eat. Please remember this. South India did not have a predominantly rice-based diet till as recently as 2,500 years ago. Rice came to South India around 600, 500 BC in the Iron Age.
Yeah.
Before the Iron Age, there was virtually no rice in Tamil Nadu. Yes, there were no. And by the way, the original idli was not made with rice. It was made purely with urad dal. We have historical records of this. They started adding rice because it was cheap and it could bulk up and you could save on the dal. Today, we add a little bit of dal to a rice idli. So that is also the archaeology of food.
Sir, with regards to idli, I have come across a source. It's a 12th century book called Manasollasa,
Yes.
and it was written by Chalukya
Someshwara.
king, if I'm not wrong. So,
Someshwara.
yeah, Someshwara. So, in that book, also the recipes for idli and vada, they don't have rice. It's purely made of urad dal,
Yes.
and that's
Absolutely.
as recently as 12th century. So,
Yes. And
yeah.
see, Someshwara is also talking about a lot of eating of rats and parrots and things like that in his royal kitchen, which today we are absolutely aghast at the thought of.
Yes.
So, you would do the world a favor if you did an English translation of Someshwara's Manasollasa, especially the food chapter.
Okay, sir. Yeah. And I had one more question. I have heard from people that fermentation came to India from Southeast Asia.
No.
How true is that?
Absolute bunkus. Ask Pramod sir about it. He'll tell you, Pramod will tell you about how they were fermenting milk and making curd at Kotada Bhadli way before we had any contact with the Southeast Asians. And the Southeast Asians had no clue about milk. See, anything will ferment normally. There is an enormous amount of fermenting agents present in the atmosphere itself. How does idli get fermented? Do we actually add something necessary to the idli to ferment it? No, we don't. So there are so many fermenting bacteria in the atmosphere and yeasts, which very, very easily ferment various different things, especially starches, which have high sugar content. So we learned about this very early on because it becomes easier to digest things which are partially fermented. So fermented foods are far easier to digest. Therefore, the idli is fermented, the dosa is fermented, the neer dosa is fermented. So the entire process of fermentation breaks down the food and makes it easier to digest. And dahi is so much easier to digest than milk because the lactive bacteria have half digested the milk already. So
Any more query?
No, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for
Anyone
taking my
else?
questions.
Anyone else? Any more query?
No more questions?
I have. I'm just waiting for the students. I have two.
Yogesh says,
Okay.
sir, I have read that frying foods like vadas and all came in later, somewhere
Somewhere
around the
around the
Maratha time period. It's in the chat. So, Yogesh, the first thing you got to understand is that the deep frying of foods was something that could only be done by rich people. You had to grow your own oil seed and then take it down to the teli to get oil. So, oil was used very sparingly. Today, we have large scale bulk growing of oil seeds and bulk consumption of oil seeds. So, fried foods were celebratory foods. Why was the puri eaten as a celebration? I mean, it's so much easier to make than a chapati.
Absolutely.
Mothers should be making puris every day. Number one, it's, well, perhaps not the healthiest thing to eat ghee fried puris every day. But number two, and more important, is the fact that you didn't have that much ghee or oil available. It was a very precious commodity. It was used in small quantities. It's actually only in the last 150 or so years that our consumption of oil. I hope that answers your question. Anybody else? There are some very interesting names in the crowd. I have never heard the name Sanjula before. Fascinating. Sorry, had to.
Okay. My first question is, Acha, Himanshi has written something.
So Himanshi Kampani says, where is it gone? Is it true that the reason why Gujarati snacks comprise of deep fried fritters and flatbreads because we were initially merchants and would travel from one place to another? Yes, no. So fried foods last better because they don't have water in them and they have been dehydrated, and the fat acts as a preventive material from breaking down the food easily. So yes, true that fried foods and foods cooked in ghee last longer on in transit, especially things like theplas are basically travel breads. But deep frying was still not really very much the norm. So it came about, as I said, again in the last couple of 100 years, and it was a treat. Okay. The thepla, of course, on the other hand, is definitely for traveling. Though I love my theplas without traveling anywhere.
Hello,
Thank you,
ma'am.
ma'am. Thank you.
Yes, Aishwarya Maske. Go on.
Yeah, sir, I'm not into food archaeology. Like, this was amazing lecture. First of all, thank you so much for that. I have heard
Thank
from
you.
my grandmother and all that the sugar was very uh, rich people used to use it, and the middle class and poor families earlier used to go for jaggery and all. So, do we have any kind of evidence that jaggery came to countries from some other country, or do we
So
know its origin?
India is the motherland of sugar. Sugarcane came to India in a very interesting way, all the way from Borneo. Exactly what journey sugarcane took on the way to India, we don't know. But we do know that definitely by the Gupta era, we were making sugar, not jaggery. We were making raw sugar, or khand as it's called. Shakkara is the word that is used in our texts. And we were definitely making it. We have some inkling from our texts that perhaps as early as the first century BC, we were also processing very crude sugar, which automatically would mean that probably in the either in the second urbanization or in the Chalcolithic period, the Chalcolithic Harappan period, we were already making jaggery. We don't yet have the evidence for making jaggery or the consumption of jaggery, but I am really we will find jaggery in some of our vessels too, because we know for a matter of fact that the sugarcane is present in India definitely by somewhere around 1000 BC, if not earlier. Again, like I said, jaggery doesn't leave behind very many traces, so we need to have either some chemical remains of it, or we need to have uh, evidence from literary evidences. But we do have literary evidences for sugar. And white sugar, as we understand it today, is a very, very recent phenomenon. We have the Bengalis to thank for it. There was a very interesting Chinese gentleman called Tom Achu, who was one of the first Chinese to come and settle in India way before the large scale. He built the first white sugar refinery in Bengal, a little bit outside Calcutta, and that is why white sugar is called chini. It was chini sugar, Chinese sugar. So it comes from the Bengali word. Okay. So we definitely had
When
it.
did Tomachu came? Exact year or something?
So we have
Approximately?
dates for him. We have dates for him. He came sometime in the 17th century. end of the 17th, early 18th. I don't have it here, but I can dig it out for you. Tom
Okay.
Achu's work is very, very, there's some very, very interesting work done by, what's her name? Damn. I know too many people by their Instagram handles and their things than anything else. Uh, so Tom Achu died. He actually married an Indian lady and all that. This is very interesting. Of course, there's a whole legendary list of Chinese coming to India, so there is no problem with that. And I'm trying to remember desperately when Tom Achu came to India, and this I think is sometime in the late 16th, late 17th, early 18th century that Tom came to India.
Okay, you can tell me later on, not a problem.
I think the dates.
I'll also try to look into
Sorry,
it.
in the 18th century, 1778 is the date. 1778.
Okay.
So
Aishwarya, you got your answer?
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you.
But it was very, very difficult to use. There wasn't that much of it as there is today. I mean, sugar can make and break governments, by the way, guys.
Yeah.
In Maharashtra, we would come together to make sweetmeats once a year for Diwali. Why is Diwali Faral made together? So the reason it's made together, of course, is the women get a chance to come together and have a little time to themselves. But it's mainly made together because there are some years which are bad years for some parts of the family. And some of the family may not be able to afford to make something nice for Diwali. So you all come together, pool your resources so that even in a bad year, you have something to take back home. So the only real sweetmeats of Maharashtra, apart from the odd chigran and the odd kheer, were essentially the laddu of Maharashtra. The besan laddus, the rava laddus, the coconut laddus. And when there was a pregnancy in the family, you would make dink laddu and methi laddu, which were made separately. Today, for some reason, they're crammed together into the same laddu, and I have no idea why we do it. But laddus were only made for weddings, pregnancies, and for Diwali. By the way, there's some Harappan laddus that have been discovered, but they have no sweetener in them from the site of Pinjore, and we're still waiting for more analysis on those. But they seem to be very interesting also.
So Aishwarya Hardikar has a different question now regarding the Harappan people.
Food habits of the Harappan people shed some light on the contemporary social diversity. Aishwarya, you should work on this topic for your, if you're doing an MA for your MA dissertation. And if you're doing a PhD, well, I would suggest something like this. It would be one hell of a PhD.
I'll surely think about it, sir.
Thank you. What are you doing, Aishwarya? What are you studying?
I'm pursuing MA in Archaeology from Deccan College itself.
Amrita ma'am is right here. Make her your guide for second year and do your dissertation on this topic. It would be a fantastic topic.
I would love to, sir.
But
okay, so Dr. Dalal, I'll now ask one question. Any other students?
Please do.
Okay, so you mentioned.
Sir, I had one quick question.
Yes, Soham, go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah. To what extent can we use linguistics to study food? Also, for example, in Indian languages, we don't have any indigenous word for tomato or potato. They all come from Portuguese origins. And even for chilies, we say mirchi, but that comes from Sanskrit marichi, marichika. That means pepper. So
don't worry
like
about
that,
mirchi. Every single Indian language has a term for black pepper, which is modified into a term for chilies.
Yeah.
From south to north. It's an amazing phenomenon. And yes, you can use linguistics for this. The use of linguistics is a very, very important interface between archaeology, people, and culture and language. And it can be used. There is an enormous amount of work done abroad on the etymology of words and how they tell you about various dishes and things like that. So just simply the way, the same dishes travel across languages and the names talk about the original names. For example, you have a Zabaglione in Italy, which becomes a Sabayon in France, and so on and so forth. So there are very, very interesting linguistic twists and turns in the tale. The names of dishes themselves very often tell you exactly what it is. Uh, they also tell you something very interesting about how things are named when you might not have a name for it. So, for example, the samosa comes from the sambusak of Turkey and West Asia. The West Asian and Turkish samosa or the sambusak has got no potatoes in it ever. But we call it the Punjabi samosa in India, and we blame the poor Punjabis for discovering it. It's not so. Lots of communities in India put potatoes inside the samosa covering. But it's the East Indians, them Bengalis, who have to be different. So they don't call it the samosa, they call it the shingara. And there's actually Sanskrit writing about the early samosa, and the samosa is described in geometric terms as a pyramid, as a savory stuffed pyramid. So yes, the linguistics of food is a fascinating, it's a rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
Archaeolinguistics of food.
Yeah. One more example I came across recently was how tamarind got its name. So tamarind is Arabic for Indian dates.
Yes.
So
Tamare Hind.
Yeah.
We don't call it tamarind, do we? Similarly, banana, it comes from the Arabic word banan, which means finger. Because original bananas were small and finger-sized. So, we call it kela, we call it kanni, call it kola. So again, the names across languages tell you about the Sanskritization and the Sanskrit influence of certain things. So certain things don't have a name that is of local origin and will have a very Sanskrit term for them. So then that will automatically tell you कि अरे भाई ये शायद north से south आया है and north से east गया है. Because these names, so for example, a lot of very interesting names for salt. So we think that the only name is namak, but the names, if you go into the hills and you go into the east, are loon and noon, and they are actually Sanskrit words.
Yes.
So there is an enormous amount of stuff, Soham. Do look me up and we'll take this discussion further. I think we should give Amrita ma'am a chance to ask her questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I mean, people who have, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But I have his email ID. I can share Dr. Dalal's email ID. If you have any query, feel free to email it to him, and I'm sure he will answer all your queries. He'll take his time out and he will love to answer all your queries. So I can do that. So my query is, you mentioned that you showed dalchini, which was a foreign spice, right? Can you just repeat from where it came?
So dalchini actually comes from Indonesia. It's from the Dutch regions, and it comes from there to Sri Lanka. And then from Sri Lanka, it gets picked up by the Dutch. So the Sri Lankans, the Dutch had plantations over there. The Dutch controlled Sri Lanka till about 1908, where in a very bizarre treaty, they had to hand it over for Phuket to the British. It hurt the Dutch a lot because they'd fought the Portuguese for control of the Spice Island, as they called it. The Portuguese, by the way, brought nutmeg to the west coast of India. So you'll have lots of Maharashtrians who very proudly tell you that nutmeg is basically from Maharashtra. It's not. It's actually a very small group of islands in the Banda archipelago which grew nutmeg. So out of 10 islands, 9 were controlled by the Dutch and 1 was controlled by the British. It's actually the first British colony in Asia. Is this island called Run or Run? Okay, R-U-N. And there's a very famous Captain Nathaniel who claimed it in the name of the British Empire. And this broke the monopoly of the Dutch, and the Dutch did everything that they could. And finally, Nathaniel was virtually murdered. They took over the island of Run and cut down every single nutmeg tree so that their monopoly could not be destroyed. Okay. And nutmeg was worth its weight in gold. It was believed to be a cure for plague in Europe, which is why the Dutch controlled it so tightly.
Okay.
There are amazing
and what about elaichi and long?
So the earliest long that we have archaeology comes to us from Sri Lanka very late, somewhere around the 7th, 8th century AD. We don't really know where it came from before that, but definitely from the Spice Islands, it was coming to South India by the definitely by the Chola period, if not earlier. The green elaichi also came from the black elaichi is Indian. It comes from the
Okay.
Himalayas. The
Okay.
cassia bark or the cinnamon that we use in India, taj as we call
Mhm.
it, also is Indian. The tamal patta is also Indian. Okay, and everybody thinks it's the laurel leaf. It's not. It's a very different leaf. So
Mhm.
our Indian spices we've forgotten, Amrita. We had this beautiful spice called trifle,
Yeah.
and it's a cousin of the Sichuan peppercorn, though a milder one with beautiful lemony, peppery flavor. Small part of southern Maharashtra on the coast and Goa uses it. Everybody else has almost forgotten it. Dagad fool, this beautiful lichen, one of the only lichens that I know that is used as a spice. Again, very, very, very seldom used these days. Things like kebab chini and others, allspice pods. Again, forgotten. Nak kesar, the
Mm.
ironwood tree fruit, again forgotten as a spice. So we've got so enamored by chilies, which kind of took over from black pepper because black pepper would only grow in specific areas. Chili would grow anywhere. Chili would grow
Anyway.
throughout the year. No seasonal nonsense. And you could hybridize chilies in so many ways.
Exactly.
Just look at the chili varieties in India. We make the Mexicans look bad. And the Mexicans probably have a couple of hundred chili varieties. We probably have a couple of thousand. And the
We
chili
have.
has taken over our food.
Okay, and my second query, which is the last query, what is the earliest dates for? Where is it coming from, and what is the earliest dates for fermented drink? I mean, I knew Israel gave very early dates, going back to almost Mesolithic. Now China is also coming up with pretty early dates.
Yes,
Do we
yes.
have a consensus in that?
No. So the dates that Professor Li Liu has got are absolutely solid at 13,000. And
Yes.
what they're saying is that the first gathering of grains to make these very this beer is not something that most people in India would drink, but there are people on the coast who know exactly what this is. So, for example, we have been making ambils on the west coast, and we have been making pokal or pangta on the east coast for the longest time ever. And fermented rice, which you keep overnight, and you turn into a, well, I don't know what you would really call it, but a porridge the next day. Okay, uh, which is a very filling food, and where the rice has been broken down, so it's not a very simple carb as it should be. uh, is something that we've been doing in India forever, and we know that in India we have had a huge story of fermentation and the creation of alcoholic beverages. The Rigveda talks about it, for example. So we have various intoxicants and beverages that we talk about, and sura, soma, etc. The words that we use, some of them were probably hallucinogenics, but most of them were definitely ferments. So if the Rigveda had them, I honestly believe that the Harappans could not have not had them. How far back we can take it in India, I don't know.
Exactly.
Again, it's the biochemists who have to work on it and tell us about it. I would suppose that if there was beer as an intoxicant, by the way, those beers would be milky beers, 3%, 4% alcohol. You'd have to drink a lot of it to really get intoxicated. But they would be there in Harappan burials. I mean, I would think we've had plants in India that can be tapped for, palm beers or palm wines as they're called. All our tadi and madi. I wouldn't be surprised if we get evidence for that also. And
Yeah, I
these are
mean, if
naturally
West
fermented.
Asia is giving us dates as early as 13,000, I mean, why not South Asia itself? Definitely. I mean, I'm sure some of the Mesolithic communities probably were also producing their own. I mean,
To just think of it, all our fishing communities who all love their alcohol, and they're the only communities in India who can actually hold their alcohol, as opposed to most other tribal communities which get very badly pickled on the alcohol. It's only the people who make mahua again, and the people. So now, who are the people who make mahua? They're basically Mesolithic hunter-gatherers,
absolutely.
even to this very day, and they ferment the fruit that they find in the forest. This beautiful plant gives these amazing fleshy flowers which are high in sugar. By the way, dried mahua can be, if it's done right, even be made into various dishes where you use raisins. It's that sweet, dried well. Though, of course, that happens very seldom. And you make all kinds of kheers and porridges with it, dried, and you soak it in water, warm water, and you let it ferment, and you make You distill mahua out of it. So even in Bengal, we've had various hadiyas and things like that, which have been made from the earliest times. And all over the northeast, we have rice wines, as they're called,
Excellent.
but they're actually rice beers. So if you have grain, you can ferment it, and Indian conditions are perfect for making. By the way, in my time in Deccan College, I was part of a group of people who drank a lot of rice beer in the boys' hostel. And there were many people from the girls' hostel who dropped by to drink that rice beer too. I will not say who was making it, but there was a lot of drinking of it. I'm sure you all are all very good children and don't do anything like that.
Shahida ma'am has a query. If you can
Please,
see.
please, ma'am, please. Shahida, how are you? Shahida and I were contemporaries together at Deccan College. Do you have any information regarding flowers which are edible? So there is an enormous list, Shahida, but again, it is not an archaeological list. It is more of an anthropological listing. So there are multiple flowers, right from roses to hadga to neem flowers to flowers of. So in Bengal, you have some very interesting flowers that are eaten. One is actually a replacement for neem. So when you have to add something bitter to your shukto, you can actually make it
Bokful.
with these
We also
flowers.
use this bokful.
Hadga. That's
Pumpkin
hadga.
flowers. Yeah.
Then you have the pumpkin flowers which are used. So very much like the
Yes.
zucchini fritters, which are so cool in Western food. The Bengalis have been making pumpkin flower. So every Bengali house usually has pumpkins growing in the backyard and climbing up to the roof. And you want to snip off too many flowers so that you have large pumpkins, right? Otherwise, if you have too many flowers turning into fruit, you will have many small pumpkins and it will take a long time. So you regularly remove the flowers and turn them into bhajiyas. And they're some of the most yum bhajiyas you can have. And you can do
Absolutely.
the same with dudhi also. I was surprised to find that Loki flowers can also be made into bhajiyas like that. So there are a large number of flowers which are eaten. There is, of course, kale fool or the mocha that is eaten also. And that is actually a very sad thing. This flower is eaten as a, uh, how do I put it in a nice way? As a survival food. When your landlord takes the bananas away, on whose land you are tenanting, you are left with the stem of the banana and the flower of the banana. So it's a starvation food. You want to eat something with your rice, you eat mocha and you eat por, which is you curry the central portion of the stalk after ripping out the outside. And you don't really get much nutrition from either. And I remember one of my colleagues telling me very seriously that considering the work that goes into processing banana flour into a dish, if the dish was predominantly banana flour, you would expend more energy making it than you would get out of it. So it would be counterproductive. So there is some very interesting stuff on this. There is mawa, of course. And see, right from the earliest times in India, we've been taking stuff and we've been fiddling with it. So ferox, for example, which everybody is big about these days, makna. Makna by itself is very poisonous and it has to be processed before it can be eaten. If you ate makna raw, you would have terrible stomach cramps and it could kill you. Okay. So you have to process makhna. I mean, I'm sure Shahida ma'am has seen the work that is done by the people on the Ganga as far as it's concerned. The fact that a lot of flowers also give us secondary products. So, for example, seeds in flowers that are consumed, your lotus seeds. Lotus seeds have always been eaten in India. They're very much part, lotus stems also. So, technically, that's also the flower that is being eaten, if you want to look at it that way. So there is a very, very interesting listicle of flowers that are eaten in India, and every year we add new things. So many of them are lost to us. The suran, the elephant's foot yam, Amrita. The flower of the elephant's foot yam is eaten by the people who grow it. So they sell the yam to the market, and the entire inflorescence is the plant. The plant is this massive flower. Okay. And you cut off the flower. There's just one central portion that you remove, which is very dangerous to eat. And then you chop up the rest like cabbage. You apply salt and you soak it in water. That breaks down the oxalic acid and other things. And then you take it out, rinse it, and you cook it just like a cabbage. And it's an incredibly yummy thing to eat. So, Indians don't waste anything, Shaida. That is the amazing thing about us. We have been eco-friendly and, carbon footprint low and all that without all these fancy words, because we haven't had much. We have had so little that we have made the most of everything that we have. And by the way, I know people who've eaten rat, okay, especially the bandicoots of the forest, and they will all tell you that they taste absolutely yummy, that the big fat wild rats are some of the most delicious things that you can eat. So, it all depends on how you look at your food. So, culture stops you from eating uh, insects, and you get all uppity about it, and then you go to Bastar and you eat that beautiful ant chutney over there. You go and you eat those beautiful ant eggs that are mixed with chicken eggs and turned into an omelette. Northeast, and you have silkworms, which are fried with a little haldi and a little garlic, and which taste like crunchy, fishy almond paste. Would I do it again? I don't really know, but it was fun doing it once.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dalal. I think with that, we have come to the end of today's session. It was really a very interesting session, and of course, so long. I mean, based on the interactive session, you can understand that people have really received it well, and so much query and interest. I'm happy a lot of students will have now develop a lot of interest into this subject, and they will look into it. So, thank you for showing a new and an interesting and a different path of taking forwarding or taking ahead archaeological studies. So thank you once again. I think, is Professor Sable there? I think he just left. He had a very important meeting. So probably he have left. Is he there?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, yes. Professor Sable, sir? Yes,
Yeah.
our HOD is
sir.
here. So I would request him to maybe say a few words on this occasion.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Dalalji, for very interesting and very informative and very means what lecture, which is based on so many evidences and so many archaeological part and material. So I think since last 1.5, everybody has enjoyed is a lecture, and very interestingly he has shown the evidences, not only this food material, but he shown the environmental thing also, how the sea level is changed and how is the environment, and how the adaptation takes place and all kind of thing. So this everybody has enjoyed your lecture since 11 o'clock, and thank you, sir. Thank you for spending your time for with our student and staff, and thank you for your precious time.
Absolute pleasure, Professor Sable. It is an honor to be invited to the Deccan College. After all, it is the old alma mater.
No,
And
no.
200th year, it's an absolute honor to be here. Thank you very much for calling me. To
Thank
you,
you.
to Amrita, to the rest of the staff, the director, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you, all the staff members and students for joining this lecture, wonderful lecture. And lastly, I thanks to our Amrita Sarkar ma'am for organizing such a wonderful lecture in a departmental discussion group. And sir, we are always searching our past students, those who are done very marvelous work in their own areas, and they should share their views in front of our student and the staff, so that we will very happy to organize this kind of lecture. And in future also, we will definitely invite you for on any other topic. So thank you all, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Very kind of you.
So that we come to the end of today's session. Once again, thank you, Dr. Dalal, and thank you all of you. I will see you all very soon with another interesting upcoming lecture for the Archaeology Discussion Group. Bye, everyone. Take care.